Welcome back to Teaching the American Tradition with Professor Postel. Today we will be discussing Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of, in my opinion, the great works in the American tradition. Um, to begin, we will discuss exactly who Harriet Beecher Stowe was. Um, Harriet Beecher Stowe lived a rather long life. She was born before the War of 1812, and she lived almost till the end of the 19th century. She was born to a pretty famous Calvinist preacher named Lyman Beecher. You may have heard of him before. Um, in 1832, uh, she moves to Cincinnati and joins a semicolon club. Um, one prominent member of that club was Salmon Chase, who later becomes important in the Lincoln administration. Um, if you're familiar with your Tocqueville, these sorts of associations and clubs are very important throughout the middle of the 19th century. Lincoln, of course, gives his famous one of his more famous addresses in 1832 to the Young Men's Lyceum. These clubs were really popular, and these clubs really facilitated a lot of the intellectual work throughout the 19th century, and Tocqueville is pretty taken by these associations and clubs that exist, particularly in the Midwest. Um, Harriet Beecher Stowe lives much of her early adult life in Cincinnati, Ohio, a very important place in her life because, of course, living on the basin of the Ohio River, she bears witness to a lot of what occurs on the Underground Railroad. A lot of this serves as sort of underpinning to her writings and uh, her bearing witness of the evils of slavery right on the border of the North and the South. Her family even participates in the Underground Railroad. They harbor fugitive slaves. Uh, on March 9th, 1850, she writes to Gamaliel Bailey of the National Era and tells him that she plans to write a book on slavery. She says in that letter, "I feel now that the time has come when even a woman or a child who can speak a word for freedom and humanity is bound to speak. I hope every woman who can write will not be silent." 1850 is a very important year, of course. The Compromise of 1850 is passed in that year, and one aspect of the Compromise of 1850 is firming up the fugitive slave law. This is one of the concessions to the South throughout the Compromise of 1850. And what this means is that the North is going to be beholden to return fugitive slaves, and according to some, complicit in the return of fugitive slaves to the South. So a lot of these political happenings start to inspire Harriet Beecher Stowe as she sees the sort of shift. This is why every woman cannot be silent, according to her. Um, so she writes a few first installments in the National Era for this book, and then in 1851, the first installment is published, and then in 1852, March 20th, 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published in book form. And it's a monumental success, both in America and in Europe. In less than a year, over 300,000 copies are sold. It's an absolute monumental success. Um, she is even invited to Europe to participate in a European speaking tour. Europeans, and particularly the British, are so taken by the content of this book. Um, in 1868, she becomes one of the first editors of Hearth and Home magazine. After the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin and after her speaking tour in Europe, she actually moves to Florida for a little while. And then eventually, in the late 1870s, she moves back to Connecticut, to Hartford, Connecticut, where she was born, and she becomes one of the founders of the Hartford Art School. This later becomes part of the University of Hartford. So that's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, as we jump into the text, I'm going to comb through this book in quite a bit of detail. I think it merits a lot of detailed discussion on the text itself. So if The lecture is going a little bit slow. Feel free to speed up the lecture speed. Um, but let's begin with the preface. The preface, I think, is very important in discussing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Beginning of the preface, what does she say? Well, she makes a sort of apology for the story, for the book. She writes, "The scenes of this story, as its title indicates, lie among a race hitherto ignored by the associations of polite and refined society, an exotic race whose ancestors, born beneath a tropic sun, brought with them and perpetuated to their descendants a character so essentially unlike the hard and dominant Anglo-Saxon race, as for many years to have won from it only misunderstanding and contempt." Her first words recall something that Aristotle says in Book 5, Chapter 3 of the Politics. Aristotle insinuates that among a nation, a regime with people of different stock, there's naturally going to be sort of factious infighting or even warfare until the two races can sort of assimilate, until the two peoples of different stock can assimilate. This is something that Harriet Beecher Stowe is remarking here. And she's also making a comment on how the different races have sort of developed, right? So she points to the associations of polite and refined society. Presumably she's speaking of people in the North who have a great deal of sympathy for the enslaved race in the South. So on one hand, you have this polite and refined society, enlightened society in the North, who understands that slavery is wrong, slavery is bad, but they're polite and refined, right? They're not exactly going to go into the South and try to eradicate slavery there. That's one aspect. That's one stock of the or one part of one stock of the American people, the Anglo-Saxons. And then you have another, who she calls the exotic race. Ancestors born beneath a tropic sun. These are, of course, the slaves that she's going to start to describe in this story. She says that their characters, to steal a word from Hegel, their physiognomies, Tocqueville also uses this word, their sort of characters, are so radically different. And one thing that Tocqueville points out is that obviously African slaves in the South are visibly noticeable, right? You can tell that they are slaves by their very race. All of these factors that go into this other race with this other background from this other place who looks different because of the way that their skin looks, and all the political circumstances surrounding the controversy between the two different stocks sort of stews and creates nothing but misunderstanding and contempt. So one of the difficulties is that even the folks in the North who are polite and refined, those who would have sympathy for those in the South, the story is so convoluted, the understanding between one another is so convoluted that one race has only received sort of misunderstanding and contempt. In other words, she's setting up this sort of society as a society, this race as a race that has sort of no hope for ultimate emancipation. However, she says that a better day is dawning. She seems to believe that every influence of literature, poetry, and art is becoming more and more in unison with the great master chord of Christianity, goodwill to man. So we have this contrast between different races, different kinds of men, men who appear different in the first paragraph, and then goodwill towards mankind as a whole. So she creates the distinctions in the first paragraph, and then she collapses those distinctions in the second paragraph. She goes on to say, the poet, the painter, and the artist now seek out and embellish the common and gentler humanities of life, and under the allurements of fiction, breathe a humanizing and subduing influence favorable to the development of the great principles of Christian brotherhood. So she seems to believe that the poet, the painter, the artist, the author, is now capable through the process of art, through fictionalizing, to actually touch the heart of the human being, sort of pick the polite and refined society by touching their hearts and turning them towards the good, turning them towards justice. She seems to be pointing out that this is what she's going to do. She's going to predicate, although her book, right, is going to be about slavery, is going to be about a political issue, um, she's going to attach it to these great principles of Christian brotherhood and elevate the discussion about slavery. Tocqueville says something in his chapters on literature about this. Um, in one of the very last sentences of his chapters on literature in America, he says, if one understands the literary tendencies of democratic people, one cannot fail to recognize um, the political circumstances as well. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially what Tocqueville is saying is that the political circumstances of people in democratic regimes, they don't trail too far behind the artistic endeavors of those people. In other words, the artistic endeavors, the literary endeavors, um, they will sort of propel the political endeavors of the people. And I think Stowe is right in this. She's consistent with what Tocqueville sees in the American people, and it's I think it's no coincidence that her book becomes such a monumental success because of this. Okay, so what is literature going to do? What is art going to do with respect to the political aspects of slavery? She says the hand of benevolence is everywhere stretched out, searching into abuses, righting wrongs, alleviating distresses, and bringing to the knowledge and sympathies of the world the lowly, the oppressed, and the forgotten. So one thing that literature can do, and one thing that Harriet believes that her literature will do, is something that Tocqueville remarks that literature does in democratic centuries. So Tocqueville remarks that literature among democratic people, or the popular literature among democratic people, tries to do something magnificent through fiction, tries to present a circumstance that's very foreign to the reader himself, sort of sweeps him away from his sort of mechanical and economical existence and allows him to contemplate something outside of himself. And not only does democratic literature attempt to do that, not only does democratic literature pull the American away from himself, but also imposes upon him in a quick flash some moral truth. This is what she believes the function of her literature is going to do. And that great truth that's going to be thrust upon the reader is the sort of truth of the necessity of benevolence. She goes on to say, we'll skip a paragraph, but the heart of the dominant race who have been her conquerors, her hard masters, has at length been turned towards her in mercy, and it has been seen how far nobler it is in nations to protect the feeble than to oppress them. Thanks be to God, the world has at last outlived the slave trade. This is a very peculiar thing for her to say in 1852, upon the publication of this novel, right? Before slavery has been eradicated, before emancipation has been proclaimed, she's saying thanks be to God. For what? The world has outlived the slave trade. So the slave trade no longer exists, and she's beginning to see the sort of turning of the tide of public opinion. Well, if the Americans can eradicate the slave trade, then how far behind will emancipation lie? This seems strange to our modern sympathies. How can you sort of celebrate the end of the slave trade when emancipation has not yet been achieved? But she is sort of also consonant with a lot of people of her time who believe that people who, by the way, don't like slavery in her time, that believe that the slave trade within the states will also be abolished following the international slave trade. Certainly an optimistic sort of belief, but one that's sort of widely held. She says, the object of these sketches is to awaken sympathy and feeling for the African race as they exist among us, to show their wrongs and sorrows under a system so necessarily cruel and unjust, as to defeat and do away the good effects of all that can be attempted for them by their best friends under it. So she says that her book primarily wants to awaken sympathy and feeling. And how is it going to do this? It's going to show wrongs and sorrows under a system so necessarily cruel and unjust, right? So it's this sort of paradox that she confronts here. She wants to awaken sympathy and feeling. She wants to touch the heart, but in order to do that, she has to describe some pretty cruel, brutal, and unjust things. So she's presenting a sort of apology here. But nevertheless, showing these cruelties is necessary to defeat and do away with slavery itself. She wants to show, in some sense, that any good effect, any sort of assistance has been insufficient so far. Anything that the Northerners have done, even if they've shown sympathy, it's not enough, right? The cruelties and the injustice are so grave and so great that pretty drastic measures should be taken. She goes on to continue into a sort of apology. In doing this, the author can sincerely disclaim any invidious feeling towards these individuals who, often without any fault of their own, are involved in the trials and embarrassments of the legal relations of slavery. Experience has shown her that some of the noblest minds and hearts are often thus involved, and no one knows better than they do that what may be gathered of the evils of slavery from sketches like these is not the half that could be told of the unspeakable whole. So, although she apologizes, by the way, to both races, she apologizes to the white race and to the blacks currently held in slavery. Yes, she will have to present slaves or former slaves in ways that, in some sense, dehumanizes them. She apologizes for this. Yes, she's going to have to present some of the folly of the white race throughout the institution of slavery and throughout the process of enslavement. She apologizes and she says that, but her apology has some teeth. Towards the end of her apology, she says, by the way, this is not the half that could be told of the unspeakable whole. So there are even greater injustices that she could present. She now speaks to the Northerners. She says, in the northern states, these representations may perhaps be thought caricatures. In the southern states, people are witnesses. There are witnesses who know their fidelity, right? So this is going to be shocking to Northern sympathies, but it's true nonetheless. Now, she continues and says, it is a comfort of hope, as so many of the world's sorrows and wrongs have, from age to age, been lived down, so a time shall come when sketches similar to these shall be valuable only as memorials of what has long ceased to be. Sort of prescient, right? These stories are sort of memorials of what has long ceased to be. The term Uncle Tom has even become sort of appellation that people apply to certain black men. She's prescient in pointing this out. She goes on, and she says, for while politicians contend and men are swerved this way and that by conflicting tides of interest and passion, the great cause of human liberty is in the hands of one. Right? Ultimately, she has faith. Why? Well, because although politicians are going to contend, although the American people are constantly arguing about liberty and what liberty means, there's one who's ultimately going to determine the course of liberty, and that is God. And she ends the preface by quoting the Psalms, Psalm 72:12. She quotes, "He shall not fail nor be discouraged, till he have set judgment in the earth. He shall deliver the needy when he crieth, the poor, and him that hath no helper. He shall redeem their soul from deceit and violence, and precious shall their blood be in his sight." God is the one who ultimately sees injustices and repairs injustices, she seems to point. Well, the question then becomes, why write the book then, Harriet? Well, it might be interesting to look to the beginning of Psalm 72. Psalm 72:1, endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. May the mountains bring prosperity to the people, the hills the fruit of righteousness. May he defend the afflicted among the people, and save the children of the needy. May he crush the oppressor. Okay, so let's jump into chapter 1 of Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly. By the way, the initial title that Harriet wanted to publish this book under is Uncle Tom's Cabin, or The Man Who Was a Thing. She later changes it to Life Among the Lowly. Okay, so chapter 1. Chapter 1 begins with a discussion between two, who she calls gentlemen. But she quickly points out that these are not exactly gentlemen. This is just a sort of convenient way of describing them. She writes, "Late in the afternoon of a chilly day in February, two gentlemen were sitting alone over their wine in a well-furnished dining parlor in the town of omitted in Kentucky." Right? So this is right across the Ohio River from her, presumably. Kentucky lies right across the river from Cincinnati, where she sort of grows up, where she spends her young adult life. So two gentlemen having a conversation, no servants or no slaves present. She says, "For convenience sake, we have said, hitherto, two gentlemen." One of the parties, however, when critically examined, did not seem, strictly speaking, to come under the species. He was a short, thick-set man, with coarse, commonplace features, and the swaggering air of pretension, which marks a low man who is trying to elbow his way upward in the world. So she's doing something interesting here, right? She describes them as two gentlemen, and then she describes gentlemen as species. That's interesting, right? So she's even creating sort of classifications within white manness, gentle manness, in the same way that a lot of people who are writing about politics, people who are defending slavery, create distinctions within the species of mankind, that species that she discusses in her preface, white man and black man, under the species under the heading of mankind. So she shows that, well, it's not all that clever, you who are making distinctions between the races. I can make distinctions between people as well. I can make a distinction within the category of gentleman. I can make a distinction within even that category or that species of Anglo-Saxon man. It's not that difficult, you wise philosophers who wish to defend slavery. So she describes why perhaps these men are not exactly gentlemen. She begins with one of the parties, and this is, by the way, a slave trader. He is a short, thick-set man with coarse, commonplace features, and that swaggering air of pretension which makes a low man who is trying to elbow his, which marks a low man who is trying to elbow his way upward in the world. Okay, so this is a guy who's primarily interested in sort of gaining power, prestige, wealth, what have you. He's trying to elbow his way up in the world. So how does she describe him? He was much overdressed in a gaudy vest of many colors, a blue neckerchief bedropped gaily with yellow spots, and arranged with a flaunting tie, quite in keeping with the general air of the man. His hands, large and coarse, were plentifully bedecked with rings, and he wore a heavy gold watch chain with a bundle of seals of pretentious size, and a great variety of colors attached to it, which, in the ardor of conversation, he was in the habit of flourishing and jingling with evident satisfaction. So this man, he seems to be the particular gentleman who is not a gentleman, right? He's a slave trader, and she points out this is the particular gentleman that's not a gentleman. Yet he's able to sort of costume himself in what he believes would be proper for a gentleman. He's able to costume himself in what he believes would make him appear to be a rich or refined man. So he puts on all of these glittering things, he puts on this sort of costume to present himself as if he's refined. But what Stowe wants to tell us is that no matter how many rings you have, no matter how much gold you can cover yourself with, that doesn't change what is sort of inward. You can never be a gentleman, Mr. Slave Trader. No matter how many riches you pile upon your body, you don't have that which makes you a gentleman. by the way, for Aristotle, the term that he uses to describe the gentleman is spoudios, or this is sort of seriousness, one who approaches life in a way that is serious, that's thoughtful. Um, so she goes on after describing his appearance, his riches, his rings, all of these gold things that he puts on himself as if it were a costume. She says, his conversation was in free and easy defiance of Murray's grammar, and was garnished at convenient intervals with various profane expressions, which not even the desire to be graphic in our account shall induce us to transcribe. So this is a supposed gentleman. This is a man who wants to appear sort of refined or at least rich, but he can't even speak right. His conversation is in clear defiance of Murray's Grammar, the popular grammar book in America. And not only does he not know how to speak, not only is he not serious in his way of speaking, um, but he says things that are so profane that even she can't express in this book. And she, by the way, has already admitted that she's going to say some pretty gruesome things in this book, some pretty graphic things. But even what this man says is so graphic that it's more graphic than the graphic things that she's going to describe in this book. So this slave trader is talking to a man, his companion, it says, Mr. Shelby. By the way, Mr. Shelby, Isaac Shelby, it's not clear that this is particularly meant to describe or be Isaac Shelby, but Isaac Shelby was the first governor of Kentucky. So perhaps she's trying to sort of recall Isaac Shelby to the reader. So they're in the midst of conversation, right? As she says on page 14, as we before stated, the two were in the midst of an earnest conversation. That is the way I should arrange the matter, said Mr. Shelby. I can't make trade that way. I positively can't, Mr. Shelby, said the other, holding up a glass of wine between his eye and the light. Why, the fact is, Haley, Tom is an uncommon fellow. He is certainly worth that sum anywhere. Steady, honest, capable. Manages my whole family farm like a clock. You mean honest as slaves go, said Haley, helping himself to a glass of brandy. No, I mean really, Tom is a good, steady, sensible, pious fellow. He got religion at a camp meeting 4 years ago, and I believe he really did get it. I've trusted him since then, with everything I have, money, house, horses, and let him come and go round the country, and I always found him true and square in everything. Some folks don't believe there is pious slaves, Shelby. Haley, the slave trader, says. Okay, so what's going on here? Shelby argues that Tom, Uncle Tom, is uncommon, and he's worth a great sum because he's uncommon. How is he uncommon? Well, the insinuation is that he's uncommon from the rest of slaves because he's honest. And what makes him honest is that he really got religion. Shelby says that he's trusted him ever since. What makes him uncommon and exceedingly valuable, according to Shelby, is that he won't run away. And religion is that which convinces him that he shouldn't run away. In other words, it gives him a sort of conscience. There's a lot of layers going on here, of course. One thing is that one thing that should be pointed out, and I don't want to dive into this too deeply, is these two men who are supposedly gentlemen, who are supposedly refined, and who are supposedly companions, according to the text, they seem to be insinuating that the important thing about religion is that it can become a tool that will convince slaves to have a conscience so they don't run away. Another layer to this is that honesty. What is honesty to these men? Well, at least to Haley, honesty, first of all, it can't be had among slaves. He seems to be pointing out that this race is so fundamentally different from the race to which he belongs, that the virtues can't even be sort of grasped, um, practiced by these folks, by these slaves. Um, Another interesting thing that's going on here is that their conception of honesty seems completely wrong, right? Their conception of honesty is to be honest in doing things that are going to uphold the institution of slavery. Um, so I think what Stowe is trying to show in this immediate conversation between these men is something, by the way, that Tocqueville shows. Um, these men can't even make sense of the good together, right? They can't even begin to contemplate something like honesty. Their sense of what it means to be honest and their sense of the good is so convoluted once slavery becomes involved in their conversations. Um, they have no touchstone, in other words, to begin to understand what it means to be honest. They're sort of out at sea. They're lost at sea when it comes to discussing what is good. Let's turn to pages 15 and 16. Haley, the slave trader, goes on to talk about another slave that had, quote unquote, got religion. He describes him as he was quite gentle and quiet-like. He fetched me a good sum too, for I bought him cheap of a man that was obliged to sell out. So I realized 600 on him. Yes, I consider religion a valuable thing in a slave when it's the genuine article and no mistake. So why is religion valuable? You can, by the way, sense in that term the sort of utilitarianness of it. Religion is valuable, particularly among slaves, according to Haley, because it makes them sort of submissive. Well, Shelby goes on and says, well, Tom's got the real article, if ever a fellow had. He goes on to describe that he allowed Tom to go up to Cincinnati, where, by the way, Stowe lived, and do business for him. And Tom is confronted by someone and says, this person asks him, well, why don't you run away? And Tom says, well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in business can afford to keep. Just a little, you know. Oh, sorry. Tom, don't mind for this moment the highlighted text. Tom says that my master trusted me and I couldn't run away. And then Shelby goes on to tell Haley, you ought to let him cover the whole balance of the debt, Tom, because he has this sort of honesty about him. And you would, Haley, if you had any conscience. And then Haley goes on to describe his conscience. The slave trader goes on to describe his conscience. Well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in business can afford to keep. Just a little, you know, to swear by, as 'twere, said the trader jocularly. And then I'm ready to do anything in reason to 'blige friends. But this year, you see, is a leetle too hard on a fellow. A leetle too hard. The trader sighed contemplatively and poured out some more brandy. So notice the sort of contrast that Stowe is creating here, right? Tom is the truly honest person. He's the one who truly has a sort of conscience. He has such a strong conscience that he is willing to not run away from slavery because he knows that he would feel bad for breaking the trust of his master. He says that I just couldn't run away. So then Shelby goes on and says, well, you'd take this trade if you had any conscience. So, right, even Shelby's understanding of conscience, Shelby presented as the sort of more humane of the two characters, he, even when he uses the term conscience, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He can't understand conscience, what it means to have a conscience, as much as the slave himself can understand it. And then, of course, Haley, he just laughs in the face of the important aspect of conscience. He just makes a joke out of the idea of having a conscience, feeling bad for doing bad things. He says, well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in my business can afford to keep. So what's more important to Haley? Profit is more important to Haley than conscience. It doesn't matter if a man is willing to do good. What matters to Haley, and the ultimate sort of measure of a man, is how much profit he can make, doing what he can afford to do to make money. Well, in the midst of their conversation, a door opened, and a small quadroon boy between 4 and 5 years of age enters the room. There was something in his appearance remarkably beautiful and engaging. His black hair, fine as floss silk, hung in glossy curls about his round, dimpled face, while a pair of large black eyes, full of fire and softness, looked out from beneath the rich long lashes as he peered curiously into the apartment. Okay, so a little slave boy comes in. And notice the way that Stowe sort of describes him. Her description, you can almost see the soul within him. You can see his humanity. His black hair, fine as floss silk, hung in glossy curls about his round, dimpled face. He's a baby, right? He's almost a cherub. Pair of large dark eyes, full of fire and softness, right? His eyes are full of fire and softness. The eyes are the window to the soul, and we can see the sort of fire of life within him, and also the softness of life within him, the full spectrum of what it means to be a human being, the ability to have passion and compassion. Long, rich lashes. He's sort of peering curiously. He has sort of curiosity. He's looking around. He's interested. He has wonder, the thing that sort of marks what it means to be a human being. All human beings desire to know. This kid's curious about what's going on in this room. And he's so seemingly innocent, right? He's so innocent. He's just peering into the room because he doesn't believe that anything bad could happen to him when he enters this room where a slave trader and a slave owner are having a conversation. So Shelby calls out to him, "Hello, Jim Crow," whistling and snapping a bunch of raisins towards him. Pick that up now. This is also revealing of Shelby's character, right? Even when he's doing something nice to him, sort of snapping raisins at him, giving him a little snack, he first of all dehumanizes him. Jim Crow is meant to sort of call to mind Jim Crow laws, the laws that are going to dehumanize. It's also the sort of general name given to slaves. And even when he gives him something that's a gift, and he's trying to be nice to him, he's commanding him. Right? His soul is so twisted by slavery that even when he tries to be nice to a slave, he can't manage to treat the slave as a human being. He can't manage to recognize the humanity and how another human being should be addressed. The child scampered with all his little strength after the prize, while his master laughed. "Come here, Jim Crow," said he. The child came up, and the master patted the curly head and chucked him under the chin. "Now, Jim, show this gentleman how you can dance and sing." The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the slaves in a rich, clear voice, accompanying his singing with many comic evolutions of the hands, feet, and whole body, all in perfect time to the music. "Bravo," said Haley, throwing him a quarter of an orange. "Now, Jim, walk like old Uncle Cujo when he has the rheumatism," said his master. So he has the little slave boy do a sort of minstrel show and dance around, and they're sort of giving him treats for doing it. Clearly meant to show how they're kind of dehumanizing him, treating him as a sort of animal, or as merely just a little show. This is set in clear contrast to the description of the humanity that we can just sort of sense in this little boy in the first paragraphs of 16. And of course, we today can sort of sense and understand the humanity, but Stowe's description of this boy, of course, would be penetrating for people who are reading about this and who are not familiar with the way that actual slaves are treated. And even those fence sitters who are kind of wondering in the 19th century, are these Are these slaves actual human beings? Should they be treated with the dignity of human beings? Because, of course, there are many people in the United States in the 19th century when Stowe writes who are sort of convinced by the really malicious philosophy throughout the 19th century that these two races are distinct and one is less human than the other. Um, on page 16, she's really trying to sort of pick the interest of that sort of quote unquote innocent bystander of the slave trade. Let's go on to page 18 and 19. Well, after another thing that you would want to pick up is the little boy, Jim Crow, as he's called. His mom comes in the room, and the slave trader, of course, is very interested in her. By Jupiter, said the said the trader, turning to him in admiration. There's an article now. You might make your fortune on that argal in Orleans any day. I've seen over 1,000 in my day, paid down for gals, not a bit handsomer. One of the more repulsive things in the first chapter, right? He says, if you would sell her to me, I could trade her down in New Orleans because she's pretty. And people would pay a fortune for her because she's a beautiful slave. He tries to convince Shelby to trade the girl and the little boy. Come, how will you trade about that gal? What shall I say for her? What'll you take? Mr. Haley, she is not to be sold, said Shelby. My wife would not part with her for her weight in gold. Aye, women always say such things, 'cause they hain't no sort of calculation. Just show 'em how many watches, feathers, and trinkets one's weight in gold would buy, and that alters the case, I reckon. All right, so this recalls our first introduction to Haley, to the slave trader. What's more important than the heart and what the heart feels about the humanity of these fellow beings is the sort of calculation that you can make about how much money you can make off of this human being if you sell them. He believes that any wrong or any sort of any pangs of the conscience can be sort of eased by material goods, by gold. I tell you, Haley, this must not be spoken of. I say no, and I mean no, said Shelby decidedly. Well, you'll let me have the boy, though, said the trader. You must own I've come down pretty handsomely for him. What on earth can you want with the child? Said Shelby. Why, I've got a friend that's going into this here branch of business, wants to buy up handsome boys to raise for the market, fancy articles entirely, sell for waiters and so on, to rich uns that can pay for handsome uns. So, of course, Haley has a sort of calculation, right? He has a calculation, he has a sort of business enterprise that he can put the boy to use in. Shelby goes on, I would rather not sell him, said Mr. Shelby thoughtfully. The fact is, sir, I'm a humane man, and I hate to take the boy from his mother, sir. Oh, you do? Ah, yes, something of that nature. I understand perfectly. This is interesting, right? Shelby says, I'm humane. I'm willing to trade Tom, but I will not trade this boy because I don't want to split up the family, right? There's sort of gradations of conscience among these slave owners and slave traders. What are they not willing to do? What are they willing to do? What can Shelby refuse to do and still sort of leave his conscience intact? He believes he's a humane man because he won't split up families. Notice also what Haley says. Oh, you're something of that nature, that our nature. So Haley believes that he's figured something out about Shelby. If he can just convince Shelby that he can maintain his humanity, then he can get what he wants to make the money that he wants to make. He just needs to appeal to his humanity. So he does so. He gives this sort of sales pitch. It is mighty unpleasant getting on with women sometimes. I always hate to see these years screechin' screamin' times. They are mighty unpleasant. But, as I manages business, I generally avoids 'em, sir. Now, what if you get the girl off for a day or a week or so, then the thing's done quietly, all over before she comes home. Your wife might get her some earrings or a new gown or some such truck to make up with her. I'm afraid not. So Haley's solution to the problem is, oh, well, if you just let the mother leave for a little while, if you get her off the farm for a little while and trade the boy while she's gone, then it'll all be hunky dory, right? Because she won't really know what's going on. Um, she at least won't be there to screech and scream, and as he goes on to say, ruin the article. Won't traumatize the young boy. He seems to say. Uh, and then, of course, if that fails to sort of deal with the fallout of doing the trade, then just buy her something, and then that will replace the hole left in her heart from trading her child. Um, I'm afraid not, Shelby says. So he's still not buying it. There are limits to his humanity. Lord bless ye, yes, these critters ain't like white folks, you know. They gets over things, only manage right. So they don't have the same kinds of feelings towards their loved ones and their children as white folks do, Haley wants to convince Shelby. That this kind of trade is hardening to the feelings, but I never found it so. Fact is, I never could do things up the way some fellers manage the business. So he goes on, Haley goes on and says, oh, I'm like you. I'm sympathetic too. I have humanity like you. He goes on to describe this fellow that he used to be a trader with. And Haley contends that he was a good guy. He was the good slave trader. Because at least he wasn't like this fellow that he used to work with, who used to beat the women when he would trade them. He goes on to say on page 20 that his humanity is the main principle of his management. But of course, if you look closely at the text, right, the purpose for his quote-unquote humanity, or the humanity that he describes, is so that he doesn't A, damage what he calls the article, and B, so that he doesn't lose slaves in the process. So he treats them nice, right? This is a man that is fully interested in utility, not justice, right? In the rhetoric, Aristotle makes a distinction between the aims of speech, utility and justice. This guy, what Shelby really wants to hear is, how can I be just and also trade my slaves? He really wants to ensure that his conscience doesn't suffer because of this trade. Haley believes that he's a great salesman, believes that he has the perfect sales pitch, but this man can't even speak in terms of justice. He's so far gone to the conversation regarding justice because his soul is such that he can't. He can't manage to speak in terms of justice, and therefore he can't manage to convince Shelby in the way that he really wants to convince Shelby. He says on page 20, I lose as few as any man in the business, and I lays it all to my management, sir. And humanity, sir, I may say, is the great pillar of my management. Mr. Shelby did not know what to say, and so he said, indeed, right? It's sort of awkward, right? Haley's trying to convince Shelby that he, Haley, is like Shelby, because he's also humane. But you can tell that this kind of makes Shelby feel uncomfortable. It's kind of awkward, right? He didn't know what to say, so he says, indeed. You have to imagine that Shelby's sort of sitting there thinking, oh, if this man says that he's humane, and I say that I'm humane, and we're both sitting here talking about trading slaves, what does that make me? Conscience is sort of pricking Mr. Shelby. Haley goes on. Now I've been laughed at for my notions, sir, and I've been talked to. They ain't popular, and they ain't common. But I stuck to 'em, sir. I've stuck to 'em and realized well on 'em. Yes, sir, they have paid their passage, I may say. And the trader laughed at his joke. There was something so piquant and original in these elucidations of humanity that Mr. Shelby could not help laughing in company. Perhaps you laugh too, dear reader, but you know humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms nowadays, and there is no end to the odd things that humane people will say and do. Mr. Shelby's laugh encouraged the trader to proceed. So you can tell that things are getting kind of awkward. Mr. Shelby laughs, and then the trader's encouraged to sort of proceed in his sales pitch. But notice Stowe reaches out and talks to us a little bit about humanity too. Perhaps you laugh too, dear reader, but you know humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms nowadays, and there is no end to the odd things that humane people will say and do. right? She really wants us to question. When we say and do certain things that we deem just or humane, are they really humane? Or are we just sort of making excuses for the actions that we do? Are we just justifying what we do because we're interested in benefiting from those actions? Or are we really doing those things because we care about human beings and we want to act justly towards them? We want to do the right thing. Um, on page 21, he sort of goes on and Haley goes on and describes his different approach, his humane approach to trading slaves as opposed to the other fellows. Now, this is where things kind of get flipped on their head, right? And we realize what's really going on with Shelby. Why is he trying to trade Uncle Tom? On page 23, Shelby's thinking to himself, "I'd like to have been able to kick the fellow down the steps," said he to himself, as he saw the door fairly closed. With his impudent assurance, but he knows how much he has me at advantage. If anybody had ever said to me that I should sell Tom down south to one of those rascally traders, I should have said, "Is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing?" And now it must come, for aught I see, and Eliza's child too? I know that I shall have some fuss with wife about that, and, for that matter, about Tom too. So much for being in debt. Hi-ho. The fellow sees his advantage and means to push it. So what we realize is that Shelby's deep in debt. He has to trade his slaves. He doesn't want to. He knows he's getting taken advantage of by the slave trader, but the slave trader kind of has him by the toe, so to speak. He feels really bad, but he sees no other way out, right? He knows that he's going to have trouble with his wife about doing this. He seems to remark that in the past, if he would have thought that he would do this, then he would have thought, no way. What kind of man would do this? But necessity urges him to do something really desperate, something that he wouldn't otherwise do. Yeah, I could go on, but we'll leave it at that. Stowe goes on to say, perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the state of Kentucky. Well, that's saying a lot, Miss Stowe, right? If you've discussed slavery and its effects on both of these human beings and their souls in such language, in the mildest state, then it must be really bad in some states where it's not so mild. She goes on, the general prevalence of agricultural pursuits of a quiet and gradual nature, not requiring those periodic seasons of hurry and pressure that are called for in the business of more southern districts, makes the task of the slave a more healthful and reasonable one, while the master, content with a more gradual style of acquisition, has not those temptations to hard-heartedness which always overcome frail human nature when the prospect of sudden and rapid gain is weighed in the balance, with no heavier counterpoise than the interest and helplessness of the helpless and unprotected. Whoever visits some estates there and witnesses the good-humored indulgence of some masters and mistresses and the affectionate loyalty of some slaves might be tempted to dream the oft-fabled poetic legend of a patriarchal institution and all that. But over and above the scenes there broods a portentous shadow, the shadow of law, so long as the law considers these human beings with beating hearts and living affections only as so many things belonging to a master, so long as the failure or misfortune or imprudence or death of the kindest owner may cause them any day to exchange a life of kind protection and indulgence for one of hopeless misery and toil, so long as it is impossible to make anything beautiful or desirable in the best regulated administration of slavery. So Stowe is saying that, well, slavery might be mild in Kentucky. It presents itself in the mildest form. Slaves aren't beat. Slaves aren't beat as frequently in Kentucky on the whole as in some of the deep southern states. But the law itself corrupts everything. You can't have justice because the law itself is fundamentally unjust. You can't have goodness because the law itself is fundamentally evil, she seems to say. And because the law itself is fundamentally evil, it corrupts everything underneath it. It even corrupts Mr. Shelby. As Plato says, the tyrant is the one who suffers most from his injustice. Mr. Shelby was a fair, average kind of man, good-natured and kindly, and disposed to easy indulgence of those around him, and there had never been a lack of anything which might contribute to the physical comfort of the slaves on his estate. He had, however, speculated largely and quite loosely, had involved himself deeply, and his notes, to a large amount, had come into the hands of Haley, and this small piece of information is the key to the preceding conversation. The key to the preceding conversation is that Mr. Shelby is in debt to Haley. So it's not just that he's trying to sell his slaves so that he can make money to pay off other debts. He's literally in debt to Haley, and the only way to come out of this debt is to trade another one of his slaves. Now the question is, why is he in debt to Haley? It doesn't particularly say. All it says is that he had speculated largely and quite loosely, had involved himself deeply, and his notes to a large amount had come into the hands of Haley. So what did he buy? Did he buy slaves and issued debt notes for those slaves, and then Haley bought those debt notes, and now he's trying to recoup those debt notes? We don't know. We don't know how responsible Mr. Shelby is for how at fault, how sort of involved in the slave trade he is for this misfortune that he's now presented with. But what we do know is that he's found in his lodgings with a slave trader, and there's something not right about the way that he talks about things, despite the fact that he truly wishes to be a humane man. Nevertheless, the institution of slavery has sort of corrupted his soul so much that although he wants to be a humane man, he can't be one. So that's really all we have for our discussion on Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. One of the things that we can sort of see about the American tradition from the first chapter of this book and the preface of this book is a real turn of the tide, or Stowe's attempt to turn the tide of public opinion with respect to slavery. One thing that Stowe touches on, that Tocqueville himself also touches on, is that slavery enervates things. The existence of slavery and the law of slavery, it affects all kinds of things that we wouldn't think that it would affect negatively. We know that it's evil. We know that it's wrong. Even people in the South, even some people in the South, are saying that the slave trade is wrong, but they seem to believe that it's a controlled wrong. They seem to think that, well, if I don't have slaves, it doesn't affect me. Well, if I treat my slaves right, it's not going to affect me. Stowe and Tocqueville both seem to point to the fact that the law itself corrupts morals. The law itself is tyrannical. And what it does is it creates injustice in all kinds of different waves across society. And if that is true, if Stowe is correct in this argument, in this portrait that she's painting, then even those who are not directly connected to slavery need to do something about it. They ought to take interest in it. So that's all we have for Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. I appreciate you joining me, and I look forward to discussing the last of the Mohicans in our next lecture. Thank you so much, and have a good day.